welcome everybody to the Food in Fiction panel at TBRCon. I will be moderating your panel today. I'm Leife Shallcross. I'm an Australian author. My book, The Beast's Heart, came out in 2018 and is a retelling of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. And I like fairy tales a lot. So we're going to be talking about Goldilocks later, but anyway. And on the panel with me, I'm going to go from the top as I can see it. So we have Devin, Madson. Thank you, Sam. Go, Dev.
Devin, Madson, also a fantasy author. My book is Narnia, Into the Stream, We Ride the Storm, and We Lie with Death, and oh my gosh, I can't even remember my own book titles at the moment. It's like 8 in the morning. The third book.
There's a third book. They're all great with excellent covers.
Thank you.
Okay, and Sam Hawke.
I too am an Australian fantasy author, and so when we're gathering, this is a time zone that's very conducive to us. These are my books: City of Lies and Hollow Empire, the Poison Wars series. It's really nice to be here, and really exciting to talk about food. I'm basically a Labrador, so I'm very food motivated. Well-suited panel.
The other guest this morning is Angela Boord, who's the only person who's in like a reasonable time zone at the moment, I think. So
yeah, I'm in Mississippi, so I don't know how reasonable it is, but here I am. Yeah, I'm Angela Boord, and I'm also a fantasy author, and I don't have both my books with me, but I have 2 books out now. I've got Fortune's Fool is one of them, and then the other one is Smuggler's Fortune. It's historical fantasy, and I like food. Food is one of my favorite subjects. I like to eat, and I like to cook, and I have a bunch of kids, so I do it a lot.
Okay, all right, well, let's jump into it then. I thought the first thing that would be great for us to talk about is like food, as Angela just said, like food is such a kind of an important fundamental part of our everyday lives. And when you're creating a fantasy world or when you're creating your story world, food is a really useful and important way to sort of illustrate part of that world. It's one of those kind of key building blocks of world building. So I thought we might start off by maybe having a bit of a discussion about how we use food as in our world building for our stories. Dev, did you have some thoughts that you wanted to share, or do you want me to throw some prompts at you?
No, that's okay. My thoughts about food and world building always end up ranty because it's entirely based on like a class system. Who gets to eat what is very much built into how your resources are organized in your world. So some people don't realize when they're just writing food, the amount of like subtle information that they're actually including as to who gets to eat what. And we do that in our world too. We have the situation where it used to be that the poor people got their water from streams and wells and from nature, and they had to eat the kind of the dark, grainy breads and things because refining was expensive. So they said, okay, so all of the pale refined foods are the good, nutritious ones that will make you like pure and intelligent and virtuous, because that's the ones that the rich people ate. And now that refined foods are cheap and easy, they don't have that anymore. And all of the whole grains are the ones that are considered wealthy food, good for you. And it's just these little tiny things that we don't really think about when, we're talking about food. that even whether something is whole grain or not is actually saying a lot about the person that you're talking about, the character, whether they are able to afford the things, but also their kind of opinions about food.
Yes, and I was sort of thinking about this too. It's often it's interesting how that can be reversed in kind of fantasy and science fiction. So fantasy novels are often based on that pre-industrial world. So as you say, you see the poor people eating, the food that is very much recognizable from the point from its production to becoming food. Whereas in science fiction worlds, often the poor people are eating the stuff that is unrecognizable as food. You're eating some kind of anonymous mush, and you don't know whether it's like mushrooms or
you just know it's brown.
Right. Exactly. Or grey. It's usually grey. I think it's usually grey.
Yeah, like
George Martin's books, they eat, the poor people eat just something just called brown, right? They just eat a bowl of brown in the port of Landing, I think.
Okay. Yes. That's a kind of stew or something, I think.
Yeah. Possibly.
Yeah.
Classic kind of leftovers. But yeah, Dev's totally right. It's a marker. In real world, it's interesting to watch the cycles of how things that were peasant food because they were cheap, like cheap cuts of meat that had to be cooked very slowly in order to be edible, ossobuco and stuff, are now like priced out of the market for actual poor people because they're fancy things to eat. Yeah, I mean, food is it's such a big question, Leife, because food as a world building tool can do just so much about your world. Like it's actually one of the best ways you can immediately give a sense of place and class and society levels and like wealth and a sense of how much you want to be drawing the reader in with familiarity versus how much you want to be showing them this is something new and exotic and different. And it's a really immediately easy way of drawing readers into your world, particularly when we're building secondary worlds and we want to kind of immerse them in something different. It's a really immediate way of bringing your reader in, because food is such a great thing to draw readers in with because it uses all of the senses. People smell the food, they taste the food, they feel the texture of the food, they have feelings about the food. The food evokes memories of other times they've eaten the food. It's just like a smorgasbord of things you can do with food.
Yeah, and the absence of food is also the same. I mean, kind of you can paint a real picture of some important stuff going on in your world in terms of who gets to feast and who gets to famine. That you can create some amazing tension with characters who just want to eat something. They're so hungry. They're starving.
The scarcity thing is quite interesting to watch in fantasy over the years because I think partially the kind of trope that you have these massive big feasts in fantasy, like that's a big thing. Everyone focuses on the feast. Partly, I think that sort of sprung out of older writers who had experienced food scarcity and at tougher times and Depression era sort of authors writing things that the fact of a big feast with all of these different things was something that immediately felt otherworldly and fantastic because people understood food scarcity in a way that perhaps is less so now. Probably there are less people reading modern fantasy who have actually experienced proper food scarcity, particularly in Western cultures. So this kind of play of drawing on people's understanding of not having enough food is probably less strong than it maybe once was historically.
What about the question of food preparation? So and like who prepares the food? Because that could be there in you can create a situation where you have a particular class of people who are responsible for the workers preparing food for the richer classes, or you could have a situation like, for example, tea ceremonies or something where the preparation of the food is an important sort of symbolic part of the sort of the meal, if you like. Do you guys have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's all about part of, using these tiny little things that we take for granted, I think, in everyday life. Like, just living, like who cooks the food in your house, and like you have to eat, you know, to live, and then we eat 3 meals a day. And sometimes when you get into writing a story, I think it's easy to forget how connected all of those things are with things like, you know, class or culture, or just, you know, what grows in your area. And we forget now, I think, with everything so globalized. Although I think we've been remembering lately with, you know, the shipping, you know, the absent stuff on the shelves and stuff, that, wow, this stuff comes from somewhere and we have to get it here. That, you know, when you start tracing all of those things back, who cooks your food, if there's like, you have, you know, like, I mean, the standard fantasy trope of being in a castle and you have like, you know, the nobles, and they don't, you know, they just eat the food while somebody else cooks them food. And, you know, if like, there's a lot of story possibilities there when you start thinking about it. Well, what if the noble is, you know, gets exiled, or they have to cook they have no idea how to cook this food. There's a lot of knowledge embedded in everything. And I think that, you know, we take it for granted. You can just get on YouTube, you can see this, you can go down to the store. But when you're really thinking about building a world and building a culture, you have to see like all these little tiny details from somewhere. Well, he needs to eat, you know, or she needs to eat. Where does the food come? Where do they get the food? Do they buy the food? Do they have enough money to buy the food? Who's making the food? What kind of food do they eat? Are they used to eating this? Are they in their own place? You know, is it the season for this kind of food? How long does it take to make? Where does it grow? You know, it's like you get your whole culture, you know, dumped on you just for trying to figure out they're having lunch. So
yeah. And Sam's book in particular has an interesting relationship with the preparation of food and the tensions that can create. Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about one of the key plot drivers in your?
Well, I mean, as I said before, they're called the Poison Wars, which probably gives you a hint. But the main characters, the main character family that the stories follow are poison tasters. So their entire kind of identity is built around this secret, horrible duty of testing food for the ruling family of the city. So their relationship with food is absolutely critical to the story, and just a huge part of food preparation and food contents and the use of food and how it's served and how you can control how it's served and who touches it and so on is really obviously like a big part of the plot of the story. But it's also a really useful way of showing character too. So the relationship that people have with food is very different depending on who they are and what they do. And because my main characters are food tasters, their relationship with food is vastly different to the relationship that other people in the society have with food, because to them, in particular to Joven, the character who's sort of actively tasting, food is his job, and detecting all of the various flavors and smells and textures and something being wrong and knowing how to make everything so that you know where things can go wrong. That's just, it's very tied up with identity, but it's also in many ways a joyless thing, because it's a functional thing for him. So the way that he interacts with food in the book allows me to say something about his character and who he is and why he is the way he is by how he describes food and the kind of detachment that he has to it, and the sort of the way that he thinks about it, versus how other characters who have maybe a more healthy relationship with food think about it and describe it when they see it. So yeah, it's a fun way of being able to use, again, tricking yourself to using something that we all have as part of our worlds, to kind of convey information to the reader, really fast, because food, obviously we just talked about it conveying sort of place and culture and society, but it also, how we feel about food says a lot about who we are as people, and like, how does the character feel about it? Are they eating for pleasure or sustenance, or is the food a distraction from their real passions, or are you using it as a sign of their snobbery or an indication about how they feel about their body or their health? And can you show something about what kind of person they are by how much attention they pay to the detail of the food and that sort of thing? So yeah, it's a super useful tool. Plus makes for fun plot points.
Just, I thought that's interesting. I wanted to circle back to something that Angela touched on just before. So that idea of, again, that idea of what people take for granted, and how you can use that to sort of flag for your reader that they're in a strange and different world, or that your character is potentially in a strange and different place. And I guess one of the examples of food in fiction that I can remember and that I really enjoyed was, I think it's Anne McCaffrey's Crystal Singer, and they're in this kind of futuristic science fiction world. There's lots of scenes where they're eating meals of, strange and weird food. And then at some point in one of the meals, she describes the character eating a bowl of small, bright green, perfectly spherical legumes. And I was like, that's peas. She's eating a bowl of peas. the way McCaffrey described this very ordinary to me bowl of peas was as this kind of completely picturesque, interesting, quite exotic sounding thing. And it was just, that was like a little kind of reminder about what Angela was saying, is that sometimes you can take things for granted that can appear quite sort of strange and different to other people. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts, or good examples that you guys have seen about where describing food in a certain way gives that sense of other. And I guess we can also maybe touch on some of the pitfalls that might sort of raise.
I'm so bad at thinking of examples on the fly.
Well, like another example I was thinking of is, quite often if you have a character in a story who doesn't eat meat, for example, there is always a point where that character makes a point of the fact that they don't eat meat. That's never presented as the norm, and people eating meat being the different thing. In most of Western society, does vegetarianism does tend to be the outlier. So that's sort of one example of how something can be kind of othered a bit because of the way that we view it.
That's right. I was thinking it's not probably
mentioned. No, you're right. I was going to make a joke. You can make a serious point.
That's actually a good example, but I often think back on the role of Turkish delight in Narnia, because it's not actually really a good example, because to in the era that it was written, Turkish delight was probably like something that was a common desired treat to the person who was writing it. But to me as a kid, I had never eaten Turkish delight, and I had no idea what it was. And the idea that this would be the food that tempted Edward, the bad kid. The idea that would be the one that sort of the food that tempted him away, that sort of ultimately led to him sort of betraying his family and so on. That made it just seem like this mystical other thing, this Turkish delight. Of course, when I ate it, that was a terrible, disappointing shock.
I know, it's not nearly as good as
it's not something that's in your immediate experience. You can take on this otherworldly sort of aspect, whereas other readers might have sort of read this and been like, oh yeah, Turkish delight, like a normal sweet. It just wasn't in 1980s Australia. It just wasn't like a kind of a treat that ever came up.
So Dev, did you want to make your joke now?
Sorry.
I was just going to say, is this where we mentioned cannibalism and other?
Oh no. Okay, we're going to get to that, but I'm saving that for the end. We'll talk about that at the end.
But of course, that
But we
cannibalism
finish on a
is
strong
beautiful,
point.
right? Yeah,
And I should
excellent.
also just mention too, for anybody watching, that if you chuck your questions in the comments, I am keeping an eye on those, and I will weave them in at an opportune time. So please chuck up anything you want our panel to address. Where were we? We were. What were we talking about? Oh my god! So yeah, exotic food. Yeah. Okay. All right. How have you used that, Angela? Tell us a bit about your.
Well, how have I used it? So I guess, I was kind of thinking about some of this and some of the questions you raised, and I was trying to think of examples, and I was like, oh, wait, I wrote a whole novella about food. It's like the whole thing's about, it's called Dragon Meat, and I was inspired to write it because I thought about all the knights slaying dragons, and what do you do with a giant child, like, sitting around there? Like, what do you do with it? And
so when a whale washes up and it just sits there and rots, and the village is like,
right. It's a giant amount of food. Like, there are people starving. So yeah, so I wrote a whole novella about, like, what you do with the giant dragons that you kill. There's more in the novella too. It kind of starts out because they are starving on the island, and it starts out with stealing food, but yeah. So I think that, I guess, kind of goes with Devin's joke about the taboo foods, because we don't think about eating. You say, well, they're going to eat the dragon, and people go, what? And then I don't know if it tastes like chicken. So that joke into
Giant bird.
yeah, right, exactly.
I mean, weren't dinosaurs and dragons presumably kind of related, just like, yeah, birds, prehistoric birds, something.
Right.
So it could taste like chicken.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, well, that actually gives us quite a good kind of segue. I thought it would be fun to kind of just talk a bit about. I don't know. When I was sort of thinking about this, I was thinking about them as kind of like window dressing foods. So they're not necessarily things that are particularly significant, but they are that kind of like, so, your Willy Wonka's kind of, magical confectionery that causes people to turn into giant blueberries or float up to the ceiling. Or I don't know if anybody else, like a real touchstone from my childhood was Enid Blyton's like Further Faraway Tree books, where they have, they eat all these amazing kind of, with googly buns and
pop biscuits
pop biscuits. Yeah, there were anyway, and I mean, obviously another example is that people are familiar with these days is all the kind of the pumpkin pies and butter beer and stuff from Harry Potter. So do you, what do you guys think about that stuff? Do you have that sort of thing in your books, Dev? Do you?
I mean, like, food is obviously mentioned in my books because people have to eat, but I've never made it either particularly, that idea of like the feast that Sam was talking about before, the kind of, is the fantasy of food scarcity. I didn't really go that route, or particularly in any kind of like trying to world build, because I'm one of those weird people who actually doesn't care about food. I eat because otherwise I die. I'm not a foodie, and so when I wrote, it just wasn't something that kind of came naturally to me when I was thinking about it. But in terms of like window dressing foods, it makes me think of the Redwall books by Brian Jacques, because they always had, every single one of those books, they would have a fancy feast, and it's always like there was no plot reason to it. They just had to have a big feast, and they had exactly the same foods every time, and there was like whole sections devoted to like discussing how many wheels of cheese they have, and like all of this. It was so, like, the contents of their larder was a whole sort of section of the book, even though it had absolutely nothing to do with the entire story. There was never a food-related plot. It was always, they were always fighting something, but there was always these big, intricately described food and feast scenes, and it was just yeah, that was my childhood.
I do wonder whether there's something about children's books in particular that really touch on and seize on children's relationship with food in a kind of a positive and wondrous way, in the sense that they kind of start from an assumption. I think a lot of children's books that kids love food, and maybe because they're not in charge of controlling their own food, the fantasy of being able to eat exciting different things at their own speed is something that authors know and hitch onto. Like Leife, you were saying, Enid Blyton, it's not just the Faraway Tree. Like, all of Enid Blyton's books, food is a huge deal. Like the Famous Five with their massive big picnics, and I just remember, I can still remember what was always on these picnics. They would have ginger cake with sardines pressed into it, and ginger beer, and they would always these sandwiches they could eat. So the kids would be eating like 9 or 6 sandwiches, and it was and the Faraway Tree in particular had the kind of more fantastical foods that I always wanted a pop biscuit so badly.
Yeah, I know.
You weren't obsessed with Enid Blyton pop biscuits, or these things they ate all the time that had you bit into them, and then there was like an explosion of kind of
sherbet or something.
Maybe they were the Google ones, I think.
Oh, okay.
The Google ones had sherbet things. Anyway, they sounded amazing, and those are the things that genuinely stay with you, and people love it. And I wonder why. I guess it's sort of a bit frivolous in a sense, like Deb was saying. It might not necessarily. You can use it for world-building purposes, but maybe focusing on food quite to that extent is probably not something you can get away with in sort of more serious adult books. Having said that, there was a whole food blog and cookbooks and stuff from Song of Ice and Fire, because people were so obsessed with the food in that. And I think George Martin used something wild, 200 different references to different kinds of food in the books. So people had a great time. I think when the show was,
and 187 of them were roasting meat.
Yeah.
Adults, people will, if you give them the material for them to get obsessed with the food in your books, they will do it. Adults will do this. So maybe it's a market we're missing out on by not focusing on it too much. I mean, some of the book promotion stuff that goes around, some of the publishers do tailored cocktails and things for books, and that seems pretty popular to do it.
That one.
So, yeah, I reckon it's a thing we should think about more.
Yeah. Do you have any kind of magical foods or? Oh, sorry, go, Dev.
No, I was going to say, they always say that food is the sex of children's literature, and I've always found that one really kind of odd phrase. And it's funny that now you mention it, this idea of this thing that is just going to be evoking feelings, but ultimately isn't actually kind of plot centric. There makes me go, oh, maybe there's a little bit more truth in that than I thought. Although, it's not like adults don't really get along with awesome amounts of food in books too. So I don't feel like it's an exact,
But it's what you say before. It's that it engages a lot of sort of sensory inputs as well, which, I mean, you could argue sex does as well. So I think it's a fair comparison.
Yeah,
we'll just put it over there.
I feel very comfortable with my mum reading food scenes that I wrote.
Yes.
It's not in children's literature.
Angela, did you have sort of any sort of magical foods in your, or those sort of special foods that you've created for your world?
Well, other than the dragons, I guess. You know what? I don't.
Of course.
I don't think, because I was thinking about that. It's I don't really have any magical, or I mean, I have there's a lot of drug use in my book, but I don't think that's quite the same thing. So
Do they eat it?
No, they don't actually eat. Well, some of them they drink, but yeah. So I don't have any of those really fantastic. I use a lot of actual foods, and for my for Fortune's Fool, I had a lot of Italian food that I had to rename because I didn't want to it would be weird to call it spaghetti, but I wanted to put that thing in. So
yes.
Pretty hard, isn't it, when you want to use something, but it's got a really real world cultural
right
thing you don't want to use because it doesn't exist in your secondary world. I want spaghetti.
Start making up names, and you're like, but it's actually spaghetti.
Yeah.
You know?
They're spherical green legumes.
Yeah.
Wiggly worms on a plate.
Yeah, I'm going to be looking out for spaghetti in your books, Angela. Okay, so all right. So Angela just raised another great segue for me. We're working through my topics really well, guys. Top marks. So I was going to talk about so we talked about kind of the window dressing foods, but what about like special kind of like plot relevant foods? So there's a couple of examples that I came up with. So you've got like the sort of like the lembas bread in Lord of the Rings. So this is this special elven bread that gives them the energy and the resources to kind of keep traveling, and you've got sort of legendary sort of epic special foods like the salmon of knowledge in sort of Irish folklore. You catch the salmon and you eat it, and you're imbued with special wisdom. What about that sort of stuff? How do you see that sort of thing? Do you guys have
biblical stories of even the apple, like it's eating something special and that having what significance is always been, I think, people that people will use, and I think fantasy's probably got quite a long history of people having like magical herbs for healing, that you've got to find a particular thing or whatever. Maybe it's less common now because it turned into such a trope that like the quest to find a particular cure or whatever has turned into a bit of a sort of an old-fashioned trope, so maybe it doesn't get used as much anymore. I'm just trying to think of any examples. Lembas bread is really cool because that's a double example, right? It's plot relevant that you can carry it around, but it also, again, is doing the extra work of saying something about the characters and the world, in that, like, it's this simple, pure substance that's kind of symbolizing the purity of the elves, and characters like Gollum can't eat it and don't enjoy it because they're like the bad side. And so it's doing a lot of heavy lifting for something that's just like a little wedge of bread.
It also lasts for ages, in the same way that the elves are really
right.
long.
Yeah, lasting. That's right. Yeah, it's long lasting, and
it's got so much happening.
It has.
There's the English translation of now I'm going to get the pronunciation really wrong here, but Mo Shangtongshu's sort of three epic sort of Chinese dramas have come out. One of them, the Scum Villain Self-Saving System. The main character is kind of transported into the game of a sort of a web novel, and he makes a sort of a hilarious point of being very exasperated with how they're always having. He can't remember the names of all the magical herbs that are just kind of scattered around this world because there's so many of them. He's like, there's something snow whatever, and there's a this and that lotus, and just gets very exasperated with the plethora of special magical herbs that are supposed to do something amazing.
Oh, Black Panther. What do they eat? The magic herb in Black Panther to get the power.
Right.
As well.
Right.
Yes. What other magic herbs?
I'm just gonna have to look at all the books behind me and see if I can think of anything.
I don't have any books in here. My memory.
We'll have to do the book looking for you.
While you're on like a live panel, it's a bad time to suddenly have like a half-formed memory of something where people were eating slivers of a particular animal in order to get powers enhanced. I can't remember what the book was now, so never mind me.
Something I want to mention though. K.A. Doerr's series, her Guided trilogy, the names of water, that's not specifically a food thing. That is just one of those where essentially the world building created a sense of having to have water is like money. They actually spend water ration in order to buy things because they live in a desert society. And I just thought, I always think of that one when I come back to world building because it was just such an amazing idea.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's probably the most basic kind of food scarcity that you can. I mean, we die much quicker if we run out of water than if we run out of food. So, yeah, water scarcity and building that into your plot.
I wonder if
it's especially relevant now too, in a way that food isn't as much.
I wonder whether it particularly resonates with us Australians as people who've had probably more drought culture than the Northern Hemisphere.
Well, right, because it's like in the Western United States. I live in the Eastern United States. We have, we do have droughts, but they're usually like it's a summer, whatever. The Western United States water rights are huge because it's very, it's much drier. So, yeah, and that's a great example of using it. Like it's the world is different, so the things that are important to that world are different, and they need to be used as plot points because their story, you can't just pick up that story and put it somewhere else because it wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's right. And like spice roots and stuff, like, so much blood has been shed over control of spices. Like that's a huge history, and you can use that in storytelling.
Yeah. So what about I guess building on that, like using, you've got your special foods, but also perfectly ordinary foods can also sometimes be sort of plot relevant. So or something that drives the plot forward. So and my example that I mentioned before was like in the Goldilocks fairy tale where she eats the porridge, and it's and the porridge is what kind of launches her into this, she spirals out of control, guys. She's the porridge, and then it's the chairs, and then it's the beds, and then the bears come home. And again, because I'm a fairy tale person, I don't know how familiar people are with the original Rapunzel tale, but that kind of kicks off when Rapunzel's mother is pregnant and has these incredible cravings for these, herbs that are growing in the witch's garden next door. And there's no suggestion that there's necessarily anything terribly magical about those herbs. It's just that she really wants to eat them, and that kind of kicks off the whole Rapunzel story. So it's a relatively common kind of lettucey, leafy green, right? Yeah.
In Western Europe,
and in various versions, it's just parsley as well. So yeah.
That's very pregnant.
Could go back to that food scarcity thing.
Yeah, but who can not sympathise with a husband just trying to get the right food for his pregnant wife? That transcends culture, doesn't it? I think.
Or arguably the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones is kind of like a food-related plot incident. It
is, and he uses it very cleverly. I think George Martin is a great example of how you can use food to set atmosphere and mood in a scene. So like the food at the Red Wedding is gross. It's like a bookmark for, it's letting you know, it's a flag for that this is a terribly wrong event. That sometimes food is described in this really lavish, wonderful way. In the Red Wedding, it's described as horrible. Like all of the food is I can't remember off the top of my head what the food is, but the description in the book, it's all bad food. The people around it aren't enjoying the food. The food is kind of disgusting, and it's giving you a signal that everything is, that the people are bad and everything is bad. And it's setting off all of the warning bells in your head. And like he also he's actually very, very good with food. Notwithstanding that most of the food is kind of Britain influenced, so it's not a huge variety of different things, but he uses it very effectively in the stories, which is probably why it inspired good books and blogs and stuff. But like things like Sansa's love of lemon cakes kind of is a symbol of her kind of youth and naivety. They're like a simple, sweet kind of dessert, and how they describe character with the relationship to food to sort of signal people who are gluttonous and greedy and often have that sort of similar relationship when they're eating the food. You can kind of see it as again, just doing clever character and world building work through a familiar medium. And once you're looking out for it, you can kind of see examples of that all over the place. But the Red Wedding is a really good one, because weddings are, culturally something we expect to see a lot of people eating food, and the food being a fairly significant thing across many different cultures and historical periods. Weddings were times where people got together and ate. So they're a useful way that you can use food in stories, I think. Yeah, we don't need any more red weddings, though, thanks.
Angela, did you have something?
Well, and I'm trying to think, and of course my mind is completely blank. Apparently I've never read anything but but in history, like, you do see it a lot, where things like I went to I didn't ever complete my master's degree in anthropology, but I did go for a little while, and I had a professor who used to talk about food events. It was never like a dinner or whatever it was. And we went to this food event, and he was always going to food events, so he liked it a lot. But it was throughout history, you can see where there have been a lot of times when people have used celebrations, foods, dinners, weddings, or whatever, to actually cause. Big historical events have happened, like people get they invite all their enemies and then try to assassinate them, like I think it's the Medici, or like with the food distribution. I know, I think it was Nicholas II's wedding, where they had a bunch of the serfs came, and they were supposed to feed people, but they didn't have enough food, and they stampeded, and hundreds of people died while the wedding was going, and they didn't do anything. They didn't try to stop it, and that sort of fed into the whole roll toward the revolution, and it's just those kinds of things and those kind of events, sort of the food and the big, epic fantasy sort of movements kind of go together.
Yeah.
That makes me think of how it ties into the kind of ritual of breaking bread and sharing meals with your enemies, and that being a kind of a sacred cultural thing, that once you've broken bread with someone, that's a hospitality offer, and then you can't abuse that position, which then makes me think of the Glencoe massacre, where the McDonald's let the Campbells in and broke bread with them, and then the Campbells murdered them all, which is don't ask Scottish people in that region about Campbells. There's still pubs. There's still pubs that have signs that say no Campbells on them and stuff.
Oh, right.
It's back, because that's such a strong thing. The idea of once you've shared
that betrayal,
proof that's a sacred thing. That shows up all over the world as an important ritual. And again, it sort of ties into that cultural importance of food, and food is such a huge thing in religion too. Christianity has stacks of rituals that relate around food, and Judaism and all that. There's just, we see it in modern religions as well as historical religions, that food is so important because it's something that everyone does, and so it gives you so many opportunities to build something unique, or to draw on historical examples if you want to.
Oh, sorry, slight segue, but we'll come back to that. But I would just, in terms of that kind of idea of food as a betrayal, or food as being a central thing in betrayal, is that in the first Matrix movie, where you've got the guy who goes back into the Matrix and betrays them, and it's mostly because he wants to eat steak. He's sick of the crap food that the people outside the Matrix have to exist on.
Well, that was his Turkish delight.
That was his Turkish delight. Yeah. Yeah.
The mush they were eating was pretty bad.
Yeah. There's that grey stuff, the science fiction grey blue.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's often food is so sort of celebrated and elevated in a lot of fantasy stories and so denigrated in science fiction. Like, I would like to feel more positive about some of these wonderful high-tech societies, that they're doing stuff that's better with food rather than just making everyone eat gruel.
I think it becomes a class discussion though, because it's always like the poor people who, or the enslaved people based on the Matrix, like who are having the bad food, and whereas if you have a class of,
I think the idea of more convenience for food and like taking tablets or shakes instead of food is still something associated with privilege in a lot of futuristic stuff. It's not necessarily
that would be great.
Maybe gruel is a
or like Star Trek and the replicators, like it's like it was like in the 50s and 60s, it was all kind of better living through science, and we were all gonna like package dinners and all through canned food and stuff, and it was like they were holding this up as the highest point of evolution
we can look forward to, right?
I know, and now we have microwaves and we've been eating this stuff and we're like, oh no, please, no replicators. It's like you get these but it's interesting, like you can kind of see back through their like cultural moments in time where you see, oh, they thought, and then with hindsight you look back and go, but that doesn't look very appetizing, you get it out of the replicator.
No. Oh dear. Okay. All right. What about food as, and I think it might have been Sam who touched on this before, but what about food as expression of character? So, like you're saying, like Sansa's love of like lemon cakes is something that you sort of strongly associate with her character. But also sort of in a broader context. So I was thinking about like the character of Sophie in Howl's Moving Castle, and one of her key roles is like she cooks the food for the people living in the moving castle, and she feeds the cute little fire demon the bacon and the eggs, and then you'll have characters whose food preferences are really strongly indicative of the character. And one of the ones that I was thinking of was in Shannon Chakraborty's Daevabad trilogy. The main character, one of the main characters, she constantly has these strong cravings for sort of Egyptian street food from her home, and this kind of it's beautiful the way this kind of expands over the course of the trilogy to kind of to become more and more important to her. So yeah, how do you guys use food to express character in the stories?
I already felt that. I already talked about how I use it. So I'm going to give it to one of you.
Yeah, it is funny how little I really thought about food for my books, just because food is not a thing that I do, and it's like, so in a weird way that's an expression of my character as opposed to any of my actual characters. Although I did have there's one particular scene in which I use it as a sense of nostalgia and grief, and so I think it's in the second book. Miku's been on the run for ages, and she's got no family, no companion. She's got she's kind of just really stuck and alone. And then when she's at an inn somewhere, she gets served these they're like cabbage wrapped crab, and it was the particular food that her nurse used to make her whenever she was unwell. And then she's sitting there just sobbing over this food in the hallway, because it's reminding her of a time when she wasn't alone and she had support. And I think that was the particular one that I drew on, using that idea of nostalgia. But yeah, I think one of the main ways that they definitely use it is in what Sam was saying about the whole idea of gluttony, was very much used in like the 1800s as like a way of showing the fat body as like an idea of like, this means they're greedy and like, but like money greedy. And it's kind of interesting how that's changed through history for us to be that it's not that the fat body is like money greedy now. It's like, but it's maintained its sense of like degeneracy. And it's an interesting one about how these things change as we go, from a simple thing of, okay, you eat a lot, therefore we're showing that you're a greedy character, to showing that you're actually like immoral in a different sense.
Yeah, I think it's right, and you've obviously got to be super careful not to fall into that link between trying to show eating as inherently wicked or sinful in a way, like, and I think a good example of how that kind of eating as a disgusting thing, showing something about character, is the tomato scene in Return of the King, where Denethor's eating the chicken and the tomatoes while Faramir's been sent out to his death, and Pippin's standing there singing a sad song, and Denethor eating. It's
so gross.
Look, his reaction is exactly right. It's just a revolting scene, and you'll never be able to think about it without just picturing those tomatoes just bursting in his fingers and the sort of bloody kind of thing running down. It's very, you can use it very evocatively, and I mean, obviously that's a visual medium, not books, but still fantasy counts. It's a good way of it's done in a way that doesn't equate kind of gluttony in a biblical sense of overeating with immorality, but it's still using an eating in an inappropriate way to signal something bad about the person.
It's funny when you see people in real life who eat like that, and then you're like, are you a bad person?
Well, only if they're eating like that while their son has been sent out to their doom. Context. I have to say this as a person who's quite prone to food spillage. I blame genetics, as I'm not good at.
I empathize.
Once I was having dinner with my sort of immediate family. So I'm one of 5 siblings, and so I've got quite a large family, and we were all having dinner with relatives, Irish relatives of ours who had come over to Perth and were visiting us, and we'd never met them in person before. But we were getting along famously. Everyone was eating around the table, and then at some point, one of our Irish relatives spilled something down the front, and like 4 of us kind of looked down, and we all had like food stains down the front. And we were like, "We're family!" It's like a bonding moment. We're all hopeless getting the food into our faces. Probably if we talk too much.
Yep. Okay, all right. We're sort of heading into the last part of the panel here, and if anybody does have any specific questions, there's been a couple, so I'll chuck them in shortly. But so food for monsters. So cannibalism. At the point where we starting to talk about, I guess, what is the consumption of humans as food in stories is usually a pretty strong flag that there is something quite monstrous going on. So you've got your kind of your standard kind of vampires and zombies sort of stuff going on, but you've got Hansel and Gretel with the witch fattening up Hansel to put him in the oven, and you've got back to George R. R. Martin. I think there's at least one story about a pie with a person in it in Game of Thrones, and I had a couple of other examples, but there's talk to me about eating other people.
I think we usually generally frown on cannibalism.
You think?
It's interesting you brought up vampires, because like vampires is one weird example where the kind of consumption of a human body part is considered sexy and not and not like monstrous.
It also doesn't necessarily kill the person. Like,
Well,
you know, you've got lots of stories that have where vampires have human pets that they like. Is it what's the sexy vampires? True Blood. You know, there's a human character who's like all they've eaten for a week is like orange juice or something. So their blood tastes a particular way for their particular vampire friend.
Yeah, I wonder what that is.
Not sure that works biologically.
Blood not. Yeah.
I mean, I think it says some really interesting stuff about kind of like predator and prey. So like it's clearly it's really, really not okay for people or characters, monsters, aliens, whatever, to eat humans. We think that's bad. But then you have all those scenes in, you know, Game of Thrones or whatever with, you know, the roasting venison and the like. How do the deer feel about humans eating? Like it's kind of a little bit hypocritical.
Game of Thrones rated very poorly among deer.
Yeah.
It's very much
Whereas,
the
like,
idea that
chickens will happily peck each other to death. And sorry, go, Deb.
Yeah, it's very much the idea that humans are special, you know, that humanist idea that we aren't just animals, that we are like above them. You know, it's a very philosophical notion, you know, that, you know, like old philosophers, you know, had a lot of this stuff about the fact that like we're special, and we're special because we know we're going to die, and all of these kind of weird ideas that we're kind of the secular version of human specialness. And it always kind of interests me because I feel like a lot of the, you know, a lot of the cannibalism stuff kind of comes from this sense that we feel that we are special and that it is different to eating another animal. You know, I always wonder when I'm like, because I have chickens, and sometimes when we have like leftover bits of chicken, I go, do I put it in their food scraps? Is that cannibalism? And I kind of wonder about this idea. And I'm like, you know, animals do this. You know, I think is it Tasmanian devils? If they have too many cubs for the amount of teeth they have, the mother will eat the extra babies. And it's like, these are just kind of normal, natural things that happen. But because we think of humans as being special, it becomes this massive taboo of like, no, you cannot do that even if you're hungry.
Yeah, I guess there's grades, isn't there? Because probably most people feel quite similarly about, well, maybe not to the human level, but they feel quite different about the idea of eating whale or dolphin or dogs versus eating cats or pigs or.
Well, there's a huge outcry every time somebody gets accused of putting horse meat in food.
Yeah,
right.
The horses, which in some cultures
they have a hierarchy of animals and how important they are, and how close to humans they are in some way. Yeah.
What's a staple for some cultures is taboo for.
It's very interesting, like how we've decided which animals fall under that criteria, because I mean, cultural and religious side, like pigs are very smart animals and close to humans in many ways, but as I said, without delving into you know, religious objections, like most people who don't have any religious objections would eat a pig before they eat a dog. You know, so it's quite interesting how we've chosen to say which animals are the ones that are. And it's not just intelligence or you know, emotional resonance or something. It's our own. We've painted our own version of what that means on top of certain animals and not others. Like people will eat an octopus, and they're so smart it's ridiculous. So maybe it's just about how often we see the signs of intelligence. Maybe it's because, I don't know.
And it's different, you know, like because some cultures do eat horses and it's fine, you know, or, you know, like insect eating is fine in some cultures. And it's when you're writing a different world and you're thinking about, well, we don't eat it in my culture, but in this place where they have a lot of these things, then like in my books, they grow silkworms, and then you have a bunch of dead, you know, you just use the cocoon to make silk. So in a lot of cultures that do grow silk, including in the past northern Italy, they would actually eat the silkworms. But you know, it's like, how far as a writer can you go with those, you know, other making stuff, if you know, like, your readers come from a certain, most of your readers will come from a certain background or whatever, or you assume that, I guess. And how far out how can you make that seem like a reasonable thing without making someone, like, triggering someone's, just, you know, attitude of revulsion to the point where they're like, nope, can't read that, you know, I'm not going to read that.
Yeah, I love making my characters eat insects. So in as appetizing way as possible. I love doing that. One of my favorite things to do in writing food in my books, because I like to use a kind of a blend of made up flora and fauna and stuff that you'd recognize in our world. And so my general sort of pattern when I'm describing food, street food or whatever, to just sort of say is that I will describe something in a way that would be extremely appetizing if it was like a potato, and then I'll make like sure that it's a beetle. And you just have like these ways.
Give it legs.
Yeah, that's right. So you're like, you're using the kind of words that readers recognize as being positive, like sizzling and buttery and all these salty sort of things. And then you just like put something, and it's a way of sneaking in like made up words in a way that's not, you know, jarring to readers who aren't just like, what is a higgleboof, you know? But you can make anything sound appetizing if you fried it in butter and you know, it's sizzling and they can smell it and stuff. You just use the familiar. But yeah, I like to make sure that because when I'm choosing what food to have in a particular world, I tend to sort of start with the geography and climate and sort of use those as the base. Like, what would grow there easily? What can they farm? What sort of meats are available? Like, are they seaside? Are they going to have, you know, ocean food or river food or whatever? And so I start from that point of view. But yeah, I like to make sure that I would they're non-wasteful societies, so they're using everything. And you kind of have that advantage, I think, in a way in fantasy, because you don't have this. Well, in most fantasy, it's sort of a pre-industrialized sort of scenario, and the way that food's controlled and stored and everything is quite different. So you don't have the luxury of, you know, people have got to eat seasonally. Like, seasonal eating is a dramatically different thing in a pre-industrial world, and you probably don't have refrigeration, right? In most fantasy books, or you have a primitive kind of refrigeration. My dudes stick stuff in barrels under the lake, but you know, you can only preserve food for so long, and if you preserve it, you probably have to salt it. And where do you get your salt from? Is salt expensive? All that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's a good easy way of making a culture feel kind of real to work out what they would have and eliminate a bunch of stuff that they couldn't have, and that sort of gives you a place quite easily. Although, yeah, lack of refrigeration is super annoying, actually. It's a lot of time. You want to describe something, but you're like, no, how would they have that at this time of year?
Yeah. And, you know, feasts usually came about too, like if you had something that you killed that was big, like you couldn't refrigerate it, so that's
you had
what
to use it all at once.
From, you know, like I don't know, you know, if you have especially like beef, and that shows up in fantasy, you know, but if you kill a cow is a very large animal, like that's a lot of food.
Yep.
For a lot of people.
It's true.
Yeah. Yes. Is it Northern Exposure, that show from the 90s where they're living in Alaska and somebody discovers a mammoth that has been, it's like a mammoth. It's like a woolly mammoth that was like frozen in some glacier or something, and it's defrosted. And one of the characters is trying to bring a museum in to come and like get the mammoth, and they're all very excited. And then a bunch of the locals are just like, wow.
My husband says, so he has cousins who live in Alaska, and they do, if like a moose gets you know, hit by the moose, they're huge, and if there's a roadkill moose, everybody goes and gets it, and then they divide up the meat, because you can't let that much meat go to waste, you know. So
yeah. All right, okay, we're coming into the last part. So if anybody has any questions, so we did have a question earlier about refrigeration, which actually, Sam, you
sorry,
really well done, good job there. So if anybody does have any questions, chuck them into the chat at this point. So I thought I would kick off with a question about, which is again quite a nice segue from what Sam was just talking about how you go about researching food. So, and just an example. So my book is set in France in the 17th century, and which meant that there were a whole bunch of French foods that I personally am very familiar with, like, souffle and croissant, and that I just couldn't use because I hadn't actually been invented at that particular point in time. So, so I ended up going and looking at like sort of, French paintings from the 17th century, like still life paintings, to see what sort of food people ate, which is fine, but you have to recognize that these were paintings that were sitting in rich people's houses, so they're always going to be the posh food. So but that was a really interesting sort of exercise in itself. So yeah, so Angela, you've said some really interesting stuff about using sort of your Italian background and sort of drawing on that to create a kind of a food landscape for your stories. So
yeah, I mean, and it's Renaissance inspired. So I had to do the same thing that you kind of did, because some stuff that's Italian we consider today wasn't around, in the Renaissance. But I mean, they had pasta, so noodles have been around for a really long time. And so yeah, I had to go back. I did a lot of Googling, but also I collect cookbooks, and so I went through there. I had to one thing that I had to do is my main character has lost her arm, and I had to figure out, because my copy editor had some questions, if you could actually roll dough with one arm, if you could make, like, I made pizza. So with I just used one hand, and it's possible to do it. The hardest thing was stirring the dough in a bowl, because it's too hard to hold on to use two arms for that.
yeah.
So I guess it's kind of like, and I like to, if I can, cook food that I think I'm gonna use or eat. But yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of weird Googling, because it's like, well, okay, people eat silkworms, and what kind of wine would you serve with a silkworm? So it's red. Actually, he drank red wine.
I love that you have an answer for that.
I need to eat.
But I do a lot of that kind of stuff.
Sam, what about you?
Look, I'm very lazy, which is why I would never write a historical thing that required me to actually be genuinely accurate about what you could have and so on. And I like I said, tend to use a blend of real world and fantastical elements in my flora and fauna. And partly that is also for laziness, because it gives me an out. Like, whatever, I have a thing that's stored at a natural temperature about that suits this climate. So yes, they can have it year round or whatever. I have never cooked anything that I put in. I know there's people who do like whole medieval sort of feasts, and while I would very happily eat them, I do like cooking, but I'm pretty lazy as well. So like anything that would require me to sort of research in any detail and then take all day cooking, it's probably a no for me. I will attend if somebody else has put in the work. But yeah, no, I'm a bit too lazy with all of my research as well. I'd never delve into historical fantasy because like I would like to use fork sleeve. And so in my world,
forks were not in common usage in 17th century France, so I had to go through my manuscript and take out every single bloody fork.
Right. Well, I want a fork. Then I'm going to yeah. So that's why I'm always in secondary worlds, so I can be, like my deal is always, like you said, illustrations are a really good, like historical paintings and illustrations are a great source of giving you the vibe, and I'm very much about, here's the vibes, sort of what it would look like or feel like, and then just sort of rolling with that rather than trying to be too detailed and accurate, because otherwise I get bored and stalled. And I think mostly readers are looking for the vibe. They're not really looking for, they want to get a sense of what your culture is like, and you know, we've talked heaps about like all of the things that food can signal, but most of your readers aren't going to be like, well, there's no way they'd have salt in that quantity at this particular time. Most of them aren't going to be at that level of picky, and I'm shooting for readers who are not at that level of picky.
What about you, Deb? You were talking before about that scene with the did you say cabbage? Was it a bowl of?
Yes.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
deliberately cabbage because
Yeah.
a friend of mine wanted me to make a character cry over cabbage.
So that was like the weird food challenge to insert into your book.
Yeah.
Nice.
There's a few of those. I think all of the books except I think the first one have cabbage being destroyed in some fashion.
I knocked over a cabbage cart also, both for Hugh and Avatar purposes.
Yeah.
And inserting private jokes is a very important facet of being a writer.
There's so many.
Okay, I don't have any more questions in. I'm just having to. I don't have any more questions from the chat. All right, so a couple of quick and dirty questions. What are your favourite examples of food in fiction, for whatever reason?
Sam's books.
The lethal.
He just does it really well. He just does it really, really well.
They're very sweet. I was thinking about this before, and something that leapt into my mind, even though I promptly forgot every book that I'd ever read. I was thinking about Sunshine by Robin McKinley. The main character is a baker, and she makes like her specialty at her bakery is cinnamon rolls as big as your head. And that has often stuck in my mind as just something, I just want to eat those damn cinnamon rolls.
Angela?
And my favorite food scene, I think, is in Chaos Peloso's the Icosar Falcon. When Queen Talion she's alone finally, and she's like, well, there's nobody here, so I can eat with my hands. And that was just like a moment of, it's like this really, you just realize how she's been holding herself together like all this time while people are, watching her, and she's the queen and everything. And then finally she gets to eat like they eat at home because nobody's around. And that's just like, I think the scene's like, I don't know, it's short. It's a short scene, and it's so powerful in terms of character and world building. So that's my favorite.
Okay, well, that's all I had for like tricksy questions to ask you and discussion topics. Is there anything I didn't cover, guys? Is there anything you want to delve back into at this point?
Yeah, I don't think so. I'm good.
I'm good too.
Great conversation.
This has been fun. Thanks, everyone.
I'm really hungry now, so I'm going to go.
It's dinner time here.
I exercised right before this. I did not have time to have a proper breakfast, so I'm starving.
All right. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. I won't say this morning, even though it is still this morning for three of us, because it's probably not morning for a lot of people watching. And I just again, I'll so get you to kind of wrap up and farewell our audience, and just you have one last chance to spruik your works, guys. Go.
No,
Okay, you made a noise first. Your turn first.
I remember what my third book was called. That was a good thing.
It was the
What's your third book called?
It's We Cry for Blood. I told you that.
Wait, my book was. And the only reason I know is because I looked down at the shelf, which is what I should have done the first time. Anyway, this was a really great conversation. Thank you, everybody.
And
Thank you, Deb.
Leifa's books, which are excellent.
Yes, and thank you, Sam. Sam's books are also excellent. Can you hold them up for us again?
If you would like your food to come with references to people pooping out their eyes sometimes, then that does make an appearance at some point in the books.
And
you do many gross things with poison in foods.
and thank you, Angela.
Yeah, okay. That's Fortune's Full, and
Yep.
it does have the eating silkworm scene in it.
Excellent. With your complimentary glass of red wine.
With it,
So,
yes, with red wine.
yeah, very important to remember. Thank you for that advice. We've at least all learned what kind of wine to have with our silkworms today.
It's
Very
very important.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great questions.
Thank you.
See you later, guys.